Thank you for joining us for our Epic Sunday School class on church history, looking at the rise of Christianity in the early days in the Roman Empire. We have Rodney Stark is where most of my information comes from, but there are other sources. And right now, it is important for us to define a couple of things here. It is important for us to define cult and to define sect. Now, cult, that's kind of a scary word. We get these images of these radical leaders that manipulate and mislead people to disastrous and tragic ends. However, that's not the whole definition of cult. A cult is actually something much broader. A cult sometimes is those scary things, but it applies to a lot more things. By at least most scholars would consider that to be the case for the word cult. Let's define some of these things. A cult is a new faith or a foreign religious import. So everybody's familiar, they're acclimated to all of these religious forms that are around them, but then all of a sudden something completely different comes along that is not like anything they've ever seen before. It sticks out like a sore thumb, right? So a foreign religious import would be a cult in this context, like Buddhism or an Eastern religion, like Hinduism coming to America. That would have been a cult at the time in that context. Or if it's a completely new faith, somebody gets some kind of divine revelation and starts accumulating followers that's very different from anything anybody's ever seen before. That would be a cult. Whereas a sect is a schism from a conventional religious body. It's not necessarily a denomination. It's not like necessarily synonymous with denomination. But what it looks like is you've got these, religious bodies, or you have churches, let's say, and then you have one that has a split and comes off, and it's going to look a lot like what it split off from, but it's going to be different enough to be called something else. That would be a sect. Building off of that last thought, a cult is significantly violating the prevailing religious norms. So let's say that you have this religious movement that most of the time has looked the same over the years. It's had little differences, but it's basically kept the whole meat is like the same of what makes that religion. But then something new comes along and twists it so much that it's completely different, or adds another component that it's no longer what it was before. That is what a cult is. It's significantly violating the religious norm. It's different enough that it's heretical, considered heretical by the people, by most of the people looking at it. Whereas a sect is started by persons desiring higher tension with the status quo. This happens when we've talked about the pendulum effect before. The Protestant Reformation was saying the church has lost its way. It needs to get back to what real faith actually means. And there's been many of these movements over the years where people see the general church that they're a part of drifting into complacency, just going through the motions, and they say, look, we need to get back to serious piety, to doing what we are supposed to be doing with our faith. So what this might look like, this is just a kind of a silly example, but it could be a real one. Let's say everybody in my church likes to watch TV, and I see how it's having a negative effect on my church and my church people. Hey, we're really just like everybody else. We're not different enough from our neighbors, and our lives would be better in Christ if we didn't watch TV at all. So I would start my television free church where everything else that was a part of my church is still there. It's just we don't watch TV. That's what sets us apart. That would be a sect. And then finally, one that has a little bit more implications for what we're talking about is that a cult is initially attracting the more privileged in a society, those with more wealth and formal education. And then the sects they initially attract the less privileged in society, those with less wealth and formal education. If you were to look at charts of different groups and the percentage of their adherents that are college educated, you would find fairly consistent correlations between the levels of education and involvement in cults versus sects. College educated individuals, they're more likely to be involved in Eastern religions, Scientology, Wiccan, New Age, Mormonism, but the college educated percentages of sects, which like the Church of the Nazarene, Assemblies of God, those are actually lower. Now, don't misunderstand the implications. It doesn't mean that people that are more educated are attracted to cults because they're smarter, right? It's because they see there are more benefits to them in terms of their life and society. They're the ones that tend to be more interested in mastering something new and foreign, maybe eccentric, the flavors of power and position that come with it. Anyway, you can read a lot more about that in the Rodney Stark book, but this does have some implications for what we're talking about. So, what was Christianity? Was Christianity a sect or was it a cult? Okay, well, first, it fits the definition of a sect. The flavor of Jesus' ministry, the way it was appearing as he was walking around and doing things, it really appealed to the marginalized, and it really looked more like just a branch off of Judaism. There were some higher class individuals that came along, like Joseph of Arimathea, the women who supported it financially. But for the most part, when he was walking around Galilee and Jerusalem, it's the poor, it's the outcasts that are getting into it. So ultimately, though, Christianity fit the definition of a cult. Now, don't be scared. Remember, we've defined what a cult is. The resurrection, Jesus' divinity, all of those things, it completely transformed Jesus' followers into a completely new religion from Judaism. No longer would it just fit in with Judaism as a branch. But then outside of Jerusalem and Judea, as it spread to the churches that Paul went to, the churches of the Roman Empire, this was a foreign religion. This was brand new. It was a cult movement by definition. This isn't like Jesus came from Zeus or anything like that. It was completely new. And this is important because what happened is the nature of the movement, it was appealing to the upper class people around the Roman Empire. And because the Roman Empire upper class people were embracing it, Christianity was able to spread differently than it would have if they hadn't. The persecution of Christianity, it really was not that systematic, and it was often haphazard through this time. If there were a couple of moments when it was concentrated and was pretty rough, don't get me wrong, but if Christianity was really seen as a threat and as an uprising of the lower classes, then the Roman Empire would have just squelched it like easily. And when the Jews revolted around the year 70, the Roman Empire basically did that. And it really hurt the Jews. It also hurt a lot of the Christians that were in that area as well. So if the Romans saw an uprising among people that they saw as disposable, they would just put it out. But because Christianity was growing among the upper classes, and it really was allowed to grow. We have records of people getting pardoned because of their high standing or their friends in high standing. So that's something that was important. It's something that helped Christianity. But it's not the only thing that helped Christianity. And we're going to get into some really good things because they still valued the poor. They still cared for the lowly, the least of these in society. That's something that we'll get to in either next week or the week after, and it's really cool what happened. But just a few examples, real quick. We have Paul. This is a passage that gives us the impression that there were lowly people in the church. He says, "Not many were wise by human standards. Not many were influential or of noble birth." But not many doesn't mean all of them. That means that there were some that were wise by human standards or influential. And keep in mind, we're not just talking about like the aristocracy, right? There was a very small sliver of the population of the Roman Empire that would be called aristocratic, but below them was lower class and upper class. So that's more of what we're talking about when we say a lot of people in the upper class, although there were a couple of aristocrats that did embrace Christianity and convert. Um, but Paul, other than this passage, has several instances where he's addressing people that were of noble position. Erastus is just one example. He's mentioned in 3 different books: in Acts 19:22, Romans 16:23, 2 Timothy 4:20. Erastus was the city treasurer at Corinth. He had some money. There's an inscription that was found that indicates so much as well. And there's Pomponia Graecina, written about by Tacitus. She was in the senatorial class, and historians now accept that this foreign superstition that she was accused of, that was Christianity. And there's some catacomb inscriptions that support that theory as well. There were other Christians in high places, not just possibly, but definitely, like Ignatius. I mentioned before that Christians with friends in high places could get pardons, and Ignatius actually wrote to his friends and said, "Don't use your power and influence to get me a pardon. Don't get in the way of my martyrdom." And he was martyred in the early 2nd century, early to mid 2nd century. They're not exactly sure when. So beyond that, analysis of language and style of the early church writers indicates that they are addressing a literate, educated audience. They're not writing to people who can't read. They're writing to educated, literate people. And there's other studies that have shown that the early Christians were the well-situated people, upper-class citizens, higher-class professions. So because of this, and some more evidence that you can read about, there doesn't appear to be a disproportionate representation of lower classes, although that has been an assumption of many people, that Christianity from early on was just made up of the dregs of society, the lowliest. And it's just not true that it was disproportionate. Now there were a lot of people in society that were lowly, so clearly it was made up of some of those people, just not disproportionately represented lower classes. Some historians even suggested that the lower classes were underrepresented, but we don't know exactly for sure how that all looked. We have the data that we have, and we work with it. But this all makes sense in our discussion, in our conversation about cults versus sects, and why Christianity grew in the way that it did, where it did. Coming up, we want to learn about the Jews that became Christians, and we also want to learn about the role of epidemics in the rise of Christianity. A timely discussion on epidemics. It might be one of my favorite things in this whole series to talk about. Some of you have heard me possibly talk about this before, so looking forward to it. Thank you.